So, Beringia, where Russia's day begins. As Dad just alluded to, I'm going to speak about the Russian Far East and an area that I was thoroughly inspired to visit. It sounded so remote and so dramatic when I was a kid. I remember reading about Chukotka and Kamchatka, and Beringia encompasses these two areas. It also encompasses some of Alaska too. So, without any further ado, I will kick off. So let's see, I'm just going to put the pointer on to laser for you. So you guys are down here in North Wales and we are going literally due north straight across the top of the planet and down the other side to Chukotka here. And this is in the Russian Far East. The blue dotted line here is the Arctic Circle, the same with this shaded in section on the left here. This is all represents the Arctic. So Chukotka sits basically over the Arctic Circle line and is a phenomenal distance from where we are. To give you an example, it has the domestic flight from Moscow to Anadyr in Chukotka takes just over 9 hours and passes through 9 time zones, and that's a domestic flight. So it's a long way away. So just zooming in a bit more, we've got the Kamchatka Peninsula here and the province of Chukotka here. And obviously Alaska. I'm going to focus on this area of Chukotka and up onto Wrangel Island up in the Chukchi Sea. So this is Beringia, as I just mentioned, Chukotka, Kamchatka, Alaska, quite a strange shape, but there is good reason for this. This is a map that illustrates where the coastline would have been about 10,000 years ago at the height, the last glacial maximum. So the very pale area here is our current coastline, and this slightly darker shaded area would have been all land during the last glacial maximum. So that leads to a land bridge between Chukotka and Alaska. So the two areas were connected, and this is absolutely pivotal to explain a lot of the diversity and a lot of the human history in the area. This is a recreation of what this land would have looked like. So the white areas are where sections of glacier, and it was quite extensive, but importantly, it wasn't completely covering the entire Russian Far East. So this is Chukotka here, St. Lawrence Island. We've got modern day Alaska all along here, but this would have been swampy, boggy ground, large lakes and rivers. And the most important thing to note on this one is the glaciation. So black is glaciation, and you can see it covering most of northern Eurasia, all over the UK, all over Greenland, Iceland, and this is the Wisconsin Glacier here. And this is really crucial for the spread of humans, because if you look carefully at it, you can see that actually, I'll just go back a couple of slides. The glacier covered right down across the Yukon and to the coast, and only left a small area of exposed land in Alaska itself. And so this actually formed a massive barrier for migration, both animals, but also people as well. So we're looking at this point at the Pleistocene epoch, an epoch of incredible animals, megafauna. So the likes of woolly mammoth, the saber-toothed cats, and woolly rhinoceros as well. And these would have been hugely distributed across the northern hemisphere, and there would have been a really widespread habitat called mammoth steppe. Now, this was a very dry, very grass-dominated habitat, and it was grazed by all these huge things like mammoths. And it's now isolated into just a handful of pockets. This is an example actually in Mongolia, but the area of Chukotka and Beringia itself doesn't really contain any mammoth steppe. It's all now tundra. This just gives you an example of how people have moved across the planet, and in particular moving up Eastern Asia about 25,000 years ago, and they were stalled by the Wisconsin Glacier that basically cut Alaska off from the rest of the North Americas. And it wasn't until the Wisconsin Glacier started to melt that people were able to push down through North America itself. But they would have encountered some incredible animals on the way, things like woolly rhinos, and there's lots of evidence that they were used widely in their day-to-day lives. This is a recreation of an old settlement or habitation that was found in Siberia, and you can see that it's using things like mammoth tusks and leg bones, and as well as lots and lots of pelts. There would be things like reindeer to help insulate this dwelling. So these days we've got a variety of different cultural zones all the way around the Arctic. But the two that I'm going to talk a bit about tonight as well are the Chukchi, unsurprisingly they live in Chukotka, and the Siberian Yupik Eskimos. And these girls and guys lived all the way around the coast of Chukotka and formerly out onto Wrangel as well. So the Yupik Eskimo, they are marine mammal hunters. They had an entirely, or still do have an entirely coastal distribution, and they would move with the change in the season. So the whole of Beringia would basically freeze over as autumn progresses, and they would move south with this freezing, and they would continue to hunt marine mammals all the way along their passage south and back north. And as things have progressed, and most recently in the 20th century, they formed more stable bases, particularly during the Soviet era, when they were basically forced to live in villages. And the same is true of the Chukchi. The Chukchi are reindeer herders and were formerly nomadic, mainly distributed inland in Chukotka, moving with their reindeer herds. But again, during the Soviet era, the Chukchi were forced into set habitation, set conurbations, and it's actually at these points that the Chukchi and the Yupik Eskimos started to mix more. Before that, they would trade, so the Chukchi would provide reindeer pelts and meat and milk, and the Eskimo would provide things like blubber and various other products from the coast. This area has also been explored as well, so not just by the resident Chukchi and the Yupiks, but by early explorers like Vitus Bering and his naturalist Stella. And they set out from the Kamchatka coast, particularly from Petropavlovsk, and also a little bit further north here, to explore the Russian Far East and try and find America. Now, their first expedition hugged the coast and went right up and through the Bering Strait. But tragically, they passed exceptionally close to America, but due to fog, which is really very, very common in the Bering Strait, they didn't see America. And they turned around thinking that America didn't exist and sailed back. And they then launched a second expedition 3 years later from Petropavlovsk, the famous expedition where they did sight and land in North America for the first time from the Russian Far East. And they then had the tragic journey back, which ended with Bering passing away on what is now Bering Island. But on those voyages, he also had Stella. And Stella was very instrumental in discovering a number of species. It was on these voyages that they documented species like Stella's sea cow, the now extinct giant sea cow, also spectacled cormorant, the species that's illustrated here on the left, a now extinct subspecies of Canada goose, Bering Canada goose. And they also identified the area as being phenomenally important for seabirds, and for marine mammals, particularly migratory whales, but also sea otters as well. And in fact, it was that discovery that led to the localized extinction of sea otter in the Russian Far East along the Kuril Islands and the Aleutians. So, Chukotka, we are focusing to begin with on this section of the planet. It's a really, really phenomenal place. It's 730,000 square kilometers, so it's 3 times larger than the UK, and it's just one province of Russia. About half the population, half the areas within the Arctic Circle, and the population is only 50,000, which is absolutely tiny when you bear in mind that the Anglesey population is about 70,000. Anglesey is, I think, 460 times smaller than Chukotka. There's probably fewer than 1,000 kilometers of road in Chukotka. It has a very limited growing season, just 80 to 100 days a year. So spring and summer are massively condensed, and before you know it, you're into autumn and then a very, very prolonged winter. And it also has an exceptionally high floral diversity for an Arctic area, namely about 900 species. So I'm going to focus on this section along the coast here. So the sea to the right here is Bering Strait, and this is the Bering Sea to the south. These are the Diomede Islands, so little and large Diomede. One's Russian and one's American. And you can get a vague idea of the topography here. So the southern side of this outer peninsula is much more rugged and mountainous, and it becomes much more rolling and lower to the north. There's a number of protected areas in this easternmost section of Chukotka. And in fact, this large one here is called the Beringian National Park. And it's split up into 5 key areas. This is Kaluchin Inlet, and then down in amongst basically some fjords in the corner down here as well. But this is all one national park here. And it's an incredible place, absolutely stunning. So the default habitat is tundra, with loads and loads of small tundra pools, some stunning flora. So we've got some poppies up in the top right, and the bleeding hearts, dicentras in the bottom left. And this is a Mongolian plover nest as well. So to give you a bit more of a feel for the landscape, you're looking at a landscape that is battered by the elements. It's frozen for about 50%, if not more, of the year. And so the species that grow there, I'm talking about plants now, have to be incredibly resilient to this landscape and these factors. So what you end up having is a lot of dwarf things. So we've got dwarf willow on the left and dwarf pine on the right. And a lot of species, berry-bearing species, so things like lingonberry, bearberry, volcanic bilberry and trailing azalea, all these really, really attractive plants, but you notice a real change in the colours as autumn progresses, and by autumn I mean August, and they all produce some form of berry. Some real beauties as well here. We've got the minuscule Kamchatka Rhododendron, the bleeding hearts, which I've just mentioned, and also a species that some of you guys may be familiar with, the Snowdon lily, which grows actually in abundance in the Russian Far East. Now for birds, you might think that this tundra is absolutely heaving with breeding waders, given the number that you see and photos down to the Chinese coast or wintering in Australia. But what you have to bear in mind is that the tundra is monumentally huge. And so the density of these waders is actually tiny. So we've got a Pacific golden plover on the left there, and redneck stint top right. Now redneck stint is one of the commonest species that we encounter, and we can find it at almost any coastal location where we land. And it breeds in lovely, slightly wet, heathy, more tundra-y ground. Pacific golden plover is also very widespread, but incredibly, we see it quite infrequently. 2 years ago, when I was last up in Russia, I only saw one in 8 weeks in the Russian Far East, and that was a juvenile that circled the ship as we were heading south, and so was it. There are other species that are incredibly range restricted, like the rock sandpiper there on the left. And that breeds in a variety of habitats, including tundra and sand dune systems and shingle bars. And we've got Mongolian plover on the right there. So the rock sandpiper on the left is a fascinating species. Although it migrates, it really doesn't go that far. In fact, some of them don't even necessarily do north-south migrations. They'll migrate east or west between Alaska, the Aleutians, and Kamchatka. But the very furthest south they might go is, say, northern Japan. Mongolian plover, on the other hand, will head a long way south, and you're looking at flights down to Australia and places like that. There are also a few passerines out on the tundra, so species like red-throated pipit on the left, Lapland longspurs are abundant, as are eastern yellow wagtails, and whenever you get any kind of scrubby, bushy vegetation, you're almost certain to find Arctic warblers breeding as well. And there are a few predators, not many, gyrfalcon on the left, and also rough-legged buzzard on the right. Sadly, gyrfalcons have declined massively in Chukotka and Kamchatka. They used to be very widespread, but they've been very heavily harvested for the falconry trade. And it's comparatively easy in Russia to get birds from Russia to, say, the Middle East and Saudi. I know one colleague who has even sat on an internal flight next to somebody who's had gyrfalcon chicks on his lap in a box. So it's incredibly straightforward, sadly. And there was one really tragic case where a research paper looking at the age of some of these giant ivories found that the locations of them were identifiable using the EXIF data from images. And so people were actually able to pull out the exact location of these gyrfalcon nests and go and harvest chicks. There's also a good few mammals on the tundra here as well, a lot of small stuff. So things like Arctic hares, top left, a number of lemmings. We've got a northern pika, bottom right, marmots and Arctic ground squirrels there in the bottom left. And they are all food, not only for gyres and rough-legged buzzards, but things like red and Arctic foxes and even wolves. So I mentioned berry-bearing plants, and these are really, really important for local communities. This is cloudberry, just one example. You can see a lovely, almost bramble-like flower here. It is a rubus, and then the fruits here developing, and a great example here of how they use the cloudberry in bread in this case. And very frequently when we stop off in any of the villages, we get treated to a feast. So they enjoy receiving people into the community, and they will bring out a huge selection of available foods. So we have things like seaweeds down here, but then this is blubber. This will be grey whale blubber and probably grey whale meat. There'll be bits of walrus and beluga in here, a variety of different berries, including cranberries, crowberries, cowberries, and a number of different cured meats and fish products. So pretty well everything is eaten. And as I mentioned earlier, the Yupik Eskimo are still marine mammal hunters. They are still granted a license effectively to hunt sustainable numbers of bowhead and grey whales annually. Both those populations are, or in the case of bowhead, increasing slightly, and in grey whales' case, stable. So overall, it looks like there's no impact. And you have to bear in mind that these dwellings, small villages, are literally miles and miles and miles away from your nearest supermarket. So getting fresh food is almost impossible in many cases unless you go out and harvest it or hunt it yourself. When we head up into the Bering Strait, if we're lucky, we coincide it with the Beringia Games, which is like an Arctic Olympic Games. It's a great meeting of local villages. For the Beringia Games itself, it's generally people from and around Chukotka and the Bering Strait. But 2 years ago, we coincided with the Arctic Games itself. So you had communities from all over the Arctic, from Greenland, from northern Norway, from Canada, Alaska, and so on. And everybody convenes, in this case, on Lorino in the Bering Strait for a really fun weekend of games. Lots of simple things, like there's a ball on a string here, and you have to kick it from a standing jump. And there's lots of rowing and sailing races as well. Plus a huge amount of dancing, and people are incredibly welcoming, and it's a really nice way to kind of get a feel for what life is like up in the Arctic and what people are going through on a day-to-day basis. And it's also a really nice chance for them to have a little bit of fun too. This is Yuri, one of our Zodiac drivers. He works with us on the ship, and he's giving the local kids a bit of a ride around here. Might possibly be more than the recommended number for a Zodiac. Right, so moving on. So this is the kind of habitat you have in the Bering Strait. This beautiful kind of fjordland habitat, long sand spits, and lots of islands. And this is where you would have had Yupik Eskimo settlements, and there's still a lot of evidence of these, the traditional settlements. So you can be cruising along the coast and see lines of whale jawbones standing upright on the shoreline. And the top left image here is a satellite image of a village called Naukan, which sits right at the very easternmost point of Eurasia. In fact, you can look across from these stone huts here to Alaska on a good day. And you can see all these round huts. These are the old Eskimo dwellings, and the square stuff is slightly newer dwellings that were put in the sort of 30s, 40s, 50s by the Soviets. And if you land here, you get to see lots of these fantastic jawbones, which are wedged into the ground. And it's thought that they were used to dry out their baidaras. And the baidaras are the hunting vessels that they would have had. So very lightweight walrus skin vessels that they would have used for whale hunting. So the area is still incredibly rich in whales, thankfully. In fact, numbers seem to have really gone through the roof. On one sailing in a 24-hour period, we estimated 1,000 humpbacks along one section of coast. So real abundance of large whales. And they come into many of these fjords to forage. It gives us an amazing opportunity to get close to humpbacks. And in fact, the day this photo was taken, we also encountered North Pacific right whale, which is one of the most endangered cetaceans on the planet. The animal was later matched from our photographs to the North American population. There's only thought to be 30 individuals left of the North American population of North Pacific right whale. And this was the northernmost record ever. So going to these areas, we are hopefully providing not only a little bit of income for local communities, but also contributing in the form of citizen science to things like cetacean distribution and the understanding of where animals are. Now, these fjords also have a lot of very sheltered habitats. So we're kind of almost moved away from tundra to this very lush, herb-rich grassland, which is just festooned in flowers. And often some quite shrubby habitats here too. And these are really good for birds. Now, there's one thing about this area which I find truly spectacular. So we can see at any moment in time on this area, 3 species side by side. One of them is northern wheatear. Now, some study has been done on the wheatears, actually from Alaska, and you can see this lower left map here. So wheatears tagged in Alaska show the longest overland migration of any passerine. They basically flight due west across Russia before turning southwest, heading through the likes of Kazakhstan, the Middle East, and they winter in the Sahel, basically, places like Ethiopia and Sudan, before returning back to Alaska to breed the next year. Now, these wheatears have actually done incredibly well, and despite it being a 29,000 kilometer round trip, they are expanding east still in Alaska. They actually breed in Canada. Now, on the opposite side, I don't know if you can see these maps, but this very top left one here shows you the breeding distribution of northern wheatears again, but here in Baffin Island in Canada, but migrating via Greenland and the UK to winter at the very western edge of the Sahel in Mauritania. And they're doing a 15,000 K round trip. We're almost at a point where these wheatears that are breeding in Alaska and very western Canada are meeting the Baffin Island birds. So it'll be fascinating to see how this migration route evolves. 2 other species that breed literally in the same bushes are grey-cheeked thrush and Arctic warbler. A grey-cheeked thrush is a North American species, and they overspill from Alaska across the Bering Strait and into Chukotka. And these guys are migrating at the end of the season, heading down through the States, or through Canada, through the States, crossing the Gulf of Mexico, and they winter in the Amazon. And at the same time, Arctic warblers here on the right are leaving their breeding grounds in the same willow in Chukotka, and they're flighting down the Russian Far East, across China, and they're spending the winter in Southeast Asia. So a moment in June, July, August, you can witness wheatear, grey-cheeked thrush and Arctic warbler in and around the same bush. And 6 months later, they will be in 3 completely different continents, completely different areas, very different habitats around the planet. Now, this area is a really interesting one for vagrants. In 2019, I found a pair of golden crowned sparrows, another North American species, holding territory in Chukotka. And I think this may be the first evidence of possible breeding of this species in Eurasia. And we also, in the same season, had a hummingbird spur fly past the ship north of Chukotka on the way to Wrangel, most likely something like Rufus hummingbird, but again, a fascinating old world record. The same willows are used by maybe more familiar species like Arctic redpoll, got a fresh juvenile there on the left and a very well-worn adult on the right. And very common species, the bluethroat. And these guys pepper any willow that is brave enough to grow up on the tundra and sing with a beautifully melodic song. Another species that inhabits these wet grasslands and tundra edges is sandhill crane. So yet again, a North American species, and a species which doesn't necessarily particularly like crossing water, has colonized Chukotka. Not only has it colonized Chukotka, it's done it well. There's estimated to be at least 30,000 sandhill cranes now breeding in Chukotka, northern Kamchatka, and they actually form a big autumn concentration, which I've never witnessed, but they all amalgamate on the Bering Strait coast and wait for perfect conditions before migrating east across into North America and down to winter in warmer areas. But this crossing is really very rarely recorded. People have seen the aggregations and they've seen a few examples of flocks crossing, but there's a vast amount of work to be done in the Bering Strait. And in my opinion, it's probably one of the most under-recorded and one of the most exciting areas for visible migration of birds anywhere on the planet. The flora here is spectacular too. Lots of blue heath, this lovely purpley flower, and mountain avens. And big meadows of bistorts and poppies and louseworts. And these habitats, as well as being good for birds, are also amazing for insects. So you'd think that in the Arctic Circle that your insect diversity would be quite small. It's not. It's an abundance of butterflies and other species as well. And at any moment in time on a perfect day, so when the temperature hits 15, 16, 17 degrees C, you can have literally thousands of butterflies in flight over these meadows. So we've got a white here, basically a green veined white on this mountain avens, and another couple of species that are quite common are small and Eversman's Apollos, very attractive butterflies. The bees here are fascinating too. So polar bumblebees have adapted to this incredibly short growing season. So I said only 80 to 100 days a year. Flowers are in flower for even less. And the bees have evolved, whilst they can fly, to walk around. So here you've got a bumble and it's clambered up, checked out one flower. And what they do is cling with their back legs to a flower, and as the flower wobbles in the breeze, they stick out their front legs until another flower eventually hits them, and they're able to grab hold and move from flower head to flower head, just like that. And also lots of grazers too. So this is Arctic ground squirrel, and these little fellas are very common, widespread on the Chukotka coast. So the coast can be incredibly dramatic too, and lots of great breeding habitat for seabirds. So we've got a little zodiac down here in the water, just exploring along the coast here, and all of this amazing mix of different cliff habitats is ideal for seabirds, and especially the alcids. So in the North Pacific, we've got 14 species of alcid. It's the epicenter of world alcid diversity, and they basically evolved to occupy just about every single niche on those cliffs and boulder screes. And they can be truly spectacular. So some huge flocks, often colonies in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions. And a really nice mix of species, things like pelagic cormorants there in the top right, a load of common guillemots, the same as you get on South Stack there, and also red-legged kittiwakes too. So this is a regional endemic. It doesn't move very far in the winter. It spends most of its life up in the very northern edges of the North Pacific, and is this beautiful, dinky little kittiwake with these incredible vivid legs. In this kind of large boulder scree, you have a mix of guillemots and tufted puffins, and you get two species of puffin here, so tufted on the right, and also horned puffins on the left. So the tufteds tend to breed in burrows, the horns like breeding in crevices on cliff edges. And the auklets, they are just amazing. For us here in the UK, we're used to 4 species. Out there, it's this phenomenal diversity of really funky looking seabirds. This is crested auklet with that incredible orange bud-like bill and the ridiculous quiff. And a real nice mix of things here. So we've got least auklet, the main image on the right. Just to give you an example of the size, this is at the top left here. We've got a least auklet next to a feather, and this is parakeet auklet in the background. And these are kitlets as murrelets. So this poor species is sadly suffering big style from climatic changes. You can see that incredibly beautiful mottled plumage, and these guys breed on glacial scree slopes. They are superbly camouflaged. They nest singularly out in the open, so much like a wader would do. And they just tuck an egg onto this scree and they incubate it with this really remarkable camouflage. And then they forage in basically glacial meltwater fjords. And they're distributed off Alaska and Chukotka as far as south as Kamchatka. But they've really, really struggled with climatic changes. And there's a fair bit of work being undertaken on them to see quite what is happening. But we do know that decline is significant, sadly. The cliffs are patrolled by things like glaucous gulls here, and these breed basically semi-colonially. We've got a pair of juveniles here, which are not far fledging, another adult and juvenile down here. And these guys cruise backwards and forwards along the cliffs looking for eggs and chicks from any of the auks. As well as the auks and gulls, are also a number of pelagic species. So northern fulmar is very, very common here. We've got a good mix of different morphs of fulmar, a few black-legged kittiwakes through the top here. Fork-tailed storm petrel and also Laysan albatross gets as far north as the Bering Strait. And we also have short-tailed shearwaters as well. So we've got a trio of short-tailed shears here with some North Pacific fulmars. Looks like a black-legged kittiwake there as well. Now these short-tailed shears are undertaking monumental migrations. They're breeding off the Australian coast. During the breeding season, they forage down to Antarctica, and in the non-breeding season, they come right up to the North Pacific. They flood through the Bering Strait, and they basically forage right up to the ice edge, so north of Wrangel. And as there's been a fairly substantial change in ice cover over the last decade or so, they're now pushing increasingly further east, as are things like crested auklet, and they've been recorded right at the edge of the Northwest Passage, which leads through to the Atlantic. And in fact, short-tailed shearwater and crested auklet alike could well move through to the Atlantic in due course as vagrants via this now nearly always open waterway during the summer. So it used to be almost impenetrable, was very rarely navigated by ships, but the North-West Passage has now become more frequently navigable. So just another example of these lovely Pacific fulmars. They nearly always show a dark tail band, even in these incredibly contrasty light morph ones. And they're still classed as the same species as we have, northern fulmar, but it's likely I can see them being split in due course, and they are separable in the field by the tail band. The area, as I've mentioned, is really good for cetaceans too. So lots and lots of humpbacks. Got this humpback down here in the bottom left, and you're getting humpbacks on 3 key populations here: the Japanese, Hawaiian, and the East Coast American populations all move north through the Bering Strait and into the Arctic. You're getting orcas, both resident orca, but also Biggs killer whale, the recently split species, which tends to be a marine mammal hunter. And you're getting an increasing number of larger whales further north in the Bering Strait and into the Arctic. So we've got a blue whale here, but fin whale especially, with the ice retreat, is pushing further north. The last time I was in the Bering Strait, we watched a fin whale moving through at incredible speed, just heading due north, straight to the Bering Strait and straight into the Arctic Ocean. There's also a few pinnipeds too, so Steller's sea lions can be found along the coast at Chukotka and widely in the Bering Sea. The Largha Seal is basically a replacement for harbour seal in this part of the world, although you do get harbour seal in the Pacific too. And one of the most charismatic is walrus. And these guys are pretty widespread along the Chukotka coast, often occurring in monumental numbers, particularly later in the season. In the summer, when there is very little in the way of sea ice, these animals are forced onto beaches, so they crowd into well-protected caves like the shot on the right there, and that means that basically they can't be predated from land by, say, brown bears or anything like that. Further north in Chukotka, the ground becomes a lot more gentle, in fact thoroughly flat, in huge expanses of bog, marsh and river. And these are home to a variety of different species again. Some will be familiar, such as Pacific eider, so still the same species as our northern eider, but they have this incredible yolk orange bill and that lovely diffuse greeny splodge on the nape actually extends around onto the cheek. Their scientific name is V. nigrum as well, and they get the name from a big black V which marks the underside of the throat. Dunlin too here, and also Eurasian white-fronted geese as well breed in this part of the world. Then you've got the likes of black scoter here, which replaces our common scoter. And if you look carefully on the rivers, you might come across Siberian brown bear. We've got an animal just looking for some salmon in the river here. And there are other species that inhabit the rivers like harlequin duck, and these are pretty widespread all around Chukotka. Now, along the coast, you get some really remarkable formations of spits, these huge, long, blocking geographical features which create massive lagoons and loads of amazing habitat. So this is at the mouth of a huge inlet called Kalutchin Inlet, and we've got a big spit which extends from the east out here, west, and another one from the western side dropping down north. So you have a very strong passage through this opening, and you have loads and loads of lagoons and pools all the way through these spits. Now this area is great for watching things like long-tailed skewers foraging, and here they come to hawk the trillions of mosquitoes, and then one of my favorite birds on the planet, I think, white-billed diver. They breed alongside Pacific divers in these lovely shingle and spit pools. Same pools are used by both grey and red-necked phalaropes. You can see actually this grey phalarope here has got a ring on it, or two rings actually. There is an ornithologist who's present through the summer months on that spit. He lives by himself and endeavours to ring as many waders as possible. He used to monitor spoonbill sandpipers on that spit, but sadly they became extinct in 2017, I think it was. There used to be 20 pairs on that one spit and down to 0. So a very sad end for that species up there. Lots of other waders breeding here too, so more redneck stints on the left. Western sandpiper, a North American species, is also very common as a breeder here. And two further North American, or what we consider North American species, pectoral sandpiper on the left and buff-breasted sandpiper on the right. So the two juvenile buff-breasted sands there on the right, they have probably hatched on Wrangel. There's a small breeding population on Wrangel Island, and also thought to be a few others on the mainland Siberian coast. And amazingly, peck sand here on the left, this juvenile was taken in August, excuse me, at Kalutchin, when it was the commonest wader. There were literally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pectoral sandpipers migrating east along the Siberian coast. And they breed several thousand kilometers west along the Siberian coast. So you're getting just a vast abundance of these birds moving probably towards America and wintering in Southern America. As I said, it's incredible for visible migration. Kalutchin Inlet appears to be a huge molting ground for king eiders. These are all king eiders in this photo. And you can have days where you see tens of thousands of king eiders all moving around headlands and going into places like Kalutchin. So just vast movements of birds. These tend to mainly be males. This is in July and August, and the birds are clearly heading off to molt. And when we've explored the coast of Kalochin, we've found millions of molted king eider feathers. So they obviously are molting in and around the bay there. But it's a very difficult bay to get into, impossible in the big ship. And so we've never actually been able to explore further inland. Now, a prize for many species is this. This is spectacled eider. Now, I have seen one male in full breeding regalia, but by the time we actually get up to this part of the world, due to ice, which is normally in July, the males have actually finished their breeding role, and they're already starting to molt into eclipsed plumage. So we've got a male on the right here, a male at the lower left, another male at the back there, and a female top left foreground. So this is about as good as we normally see them. But because they've molted all their flight feathers, like this bird on the right, they don't fly away, which does mean you can get quite close to them. And from what we can gather, these guys seem to molt along very rocky coastlines and in just ones and twos, rather than the king eiders molting in huge flocks. I mentioned whales, so the northern coast of Chukotka is really phenomenal for cetaceans, so hundreds of humpbacks, grey whales, lots of bowheads too, and they really give amazing views. So we're able just to take the Zodiacs out, sit, watch, and most often animals will come right next to us, so we don't even need to move around to watch these humpbacks. And I mentioned walruses too, and in monumental numbers. So we discovered this incredible site a few years back. It's a spit called Tsitsikamen on the north coast of Chukotka. And when we landed, there's a lovely lagoon behind to the left of this photo. And we landed on the beach and realized there were lots of these kind of old middens of whale bones. And we started to check it out. And there was a lot of evidence of hunting. There were a lot of dead walruses here, but there were no walruses on the beach. And so the photo on the right is what we were looking at. This is a walrus harpoon, and this big open beach, the lagoon here on the right-hand side in this case. And if any of you saw 7 Worlds, One Planet a few years ago, there were some sequences of walrus falling off cliffs. Well, this is part of the footage, and this is the beach that they filmed it on. So if you were to come back in October, this is what the beach would look like. Monumental number of walrus, around 100,000. There's no lagoon entrance. They literally cover the whole lot. And at this time of the year, the sea ice hasn't yet formed. But they're getting driven further south, so they need to haul out, and they come out onto big beaches like this. And exploring the coast, you can see here there are literally centuries of basically mammal harvest. This was a prime Yupik Eskimo strategic hunting location. They would have had camp after camp after camp, year after year after year in this bay. And if you look through the cuts through the dunes, you could see all this organic matter here, the darker stuff, bits of grey whale, bowheads, and walruses that's piled up. And searching harder, we found some incredible artifacts. So these are old flensing stones here that would have been used for cutting blubber. Then we've got harpoon heads. So these would have been probably detachable harpoon heads for whales. This incredible old spearhead. And we think that this item here on the right is an old necklace or some form of jewelry. It's a seal jawbone that's had 2 holes chiseled in it. And each of these little notches here is actually exaggerating a tooth. So there's a tiny tooth present in each of these points. And we think it was worn across the neck, basically. So a really remarkable place, really exciting to visit somewhere like this, knowing that maybe for 3,000 years there have been people coming to this bay to look for and hunt things like walrus. Right. So next stop, we are heading to Wrangel. We've come from the Chukotkan coast and we are taking a diagonal up to this incredible island in the Chukchi Sea. Now, Wrangel has a lot of this around it. It is ice. And in fact, for At least 50% of the year, it is normally completely solidly iced in. So this is Wrangel here and the Siberian coastline. You can see a big set of completely solid ice around it. These big lumps here that you can see on the satellite imagery are multi-year ice, which is really, really important. It's very thick, very stable ice. And it makes it a brilliant place for Arctic wildlife. So just to give you an idea, this is Wrangel Island and its little neighbour Herald Island. Herald is exceptionally important for denning polar bears. You've got a very large plain to the north and then basically the mountains running through the southern and central section of Wrangel. So Wrangel's about 7,600 square k. That's 11 times bigger than Anglesey. It is a national park, but it does have a military base on it as well. It has the highest density, along with Herald Island, of denning polar bears on the planet. It has Asia's only snow goose colony. It has a remarkable flora, 449 species. Mammoths were still roaming on Wrangel until 3,500 years ago. And at the same time, there's evidence of Paleo-Eskimos arriving in the south of Wrangel in Doubtful Bay. And at that point, mammoth goes extinct. From what we know, mammoths, well, actually, I'll talk about mammoths a little bit more. So just to give you a bit more of an idea, Wrangel, so Wrangel is here, 71 degrees north. And to compare that, the very top of Ellesmere Island here is about 83 degrees north. Svalbard sits at about 79 to 80 degrees north. So Wrangel is about the equivalent of the north coast, the very northern coast of Norway and northern Alaska. These are just the main features. So Doubtful Bay here is where the main ranger station is. There's a military base here. And the highest point is a similar height to Snowdon, 1,096 meters. Getting to Wrangel can be a challenge. So normally in our little ship, we have to work our way around ice and get in wherever we can. The last time we sailed north in 2019, we were in an icebreaker, which meant getting there was a lot easier. And you have views like this approaching Wrangel. And as you move through the ice, you are continually seeing small groups of walrus here hold out. And this would be a pretty typical scene. So a group in the water, another group just coming out, and a very dense group further back. Now, as you get to Wrangel, these are some of the scenes. These aren't my images, but this is the northern section of Wrangel. So a very, very flat plain, a long braided river flowing out of the mountains. Lots more spits, very, very barren spits, which can be good for walrus haulouts. And some lovely rolling hillsides, and in some places quite rugged coast as well. Now, as I said, mammoths were here till 3,500 years ago. We know now, looking at genetic work, that mammoths were on their way out on Wrangel when Paleo-Eskimos arrived. And the genetic work shows that they were highly inbred. And that would probably have driven their extinction. And it might have been that Paleo-Eskimos were basically the final nail in the coffin. But it's not impossible to walk up the rivers and find scenes like this, a mammoth tusk exposed by rainfall or meltwater from the riverbeds. And the rangers' huts all have multiple mammoth tusks propped up against their sheds. So here we've got a couple of mammoth tusks centre and right, a muskox skull and a walrus skull here. Now, amazingly, mammoth remains a highly abundant in Siberia. And in fact, there's a recent stat that I heard was that 80% of all ivory on the market is actually mammoth ivory rather than elephant ivory. So this is the main rangers station at Doubtful in Wrangel. You can see what kind of place it is. It's got the remnants of a more Soviet era. There's a lot of old oil drums, lots of wood that's been brought in and chucked out, and the place can look a little bit dilapidated. This is one of the actual rangers' huts it's lived in, but it doesn't look in quite the best of states. And if you look closely, you'll see that all the windows and all the doors have this armoring on them, huge nails stuck to the frame. And this is because almost daily through the latter part of the summer, you'll get visitors, these big white furry visitors that like to come and have a closer look at where you live. Now, the polar bears on Wrangel seem to be have very different behaviours to those on places like Svalbard. We spend a lot of time onshore at Wrangel, and we frequently have close encounters with bears. They will often come wandering towards us. We're able to read behaviour pretty well with these animals, and we're always accompanied by rangers on the island, but we don't carry any live munitions, and we use behaviour cues from the bears and our own behaviour to make sure that the situations that we are in are always safe and sensible. But it's quite a remarkable experience to be walking on the tundra and have the largest land predator on the planet only 50 or 60 meters away from you. So around 600 bears, female bears den on Wrangel and Herald Island. It's really phenomenal. It's quite bizarre to see them later on in the summer. So come July and August especially, when the sea ice has gone from around Wrangel, the bears all come ashore, and you see these incredible white blobs on the hillside, and they're mainly just chilling out. The summer is the toughest time for bears. They use the sea ice to their advantage always. It's where they're hunting their seals from. And so during the summer, they're trying to conserve as much energy as possible and take advantage of food sources whenever they can. And this is when Heritage Expedition recorded the largest aggregation ever of polar bears. This was, I think, 4 years ago now. And over 200 bears had come together on the carcass of a bowhead whale, which had washed up on a beach at Wrangel. And this was the scene from the ship. At first sight, people commented on how it looked like sheep. And then as they got closer, they realized they were a plethora of bears, mums and cubs, adult males, adolescents, all quite happily feeding away and relaxing. And in fact, whilst there's been a lot of concern about retreating ice and the impact it will have on bears, there's also been some work done looking at the provisioning of whale carcasses on places like the Chukchi Sea. So as the whale population goes up, there are going to be more whale carcasses washing up. And actually, you only need about 20 whale carcasses a year in the Chukchi Sea to maintain the population of polar bears in that region. And it's good around Wrangel to see really, really healthy looking bears. So this is a mother and her two-year-old cubs. They're female here. She's got little white tags in her ears. She was actually tagged in Alaska. So this bear has covered about 600 kilometers to get to where we saw her. And they always look really healthy. In fact, of all the bears that I've seen up there, and that's a lot, we can see 40, 50 bears in a trip. I've only seen one bear that was underweight. So it's great to see, there's a really fat youngster here on the left. These two cubs are munching on a freshly killed walrus. And they generally look very rotund and very healthy. So if you want to see polar bears, it's undoubtedly the best place on the planet to see polar bears. And polar bears doing what polar bears do best, which is on ice, hunting walruses, and just looking absolutely awesome. So Wrangel has, until recently, only one main mammalian predator, and that was Arctic fox. And it also had two herbivores, which is the Wrangel brown lemming and Wrangel collared lemming here. And it had a few aerial predators, so snowy owl, not my photo unfortunately, and pomerine and long-tailed skewers would all predate not only the lemmings and things like that, but waders and other smaller birds. But things have changed in the last 70, 80 years on Wrangel. To begin with, reindeer were introduced in the sort of 40s, 50s, 1940s and 50s. And to begin with, they did very well. And they actually did maybe too well. And then combined with muskox, which were introduced in the 70s, they started to heavily graze the island. Now, it was said that until the introduction of these large herbivores, there were areas in the centre of the island that still had willow copses that were up to about 6 or 7 foot high. But with the introduction of reindeer and muskox, these were quite rapidly grazed down. Now, in the last decade, reindeer has actually become naturally extinct, which is not a bad thing. There's about 1,000 muskox on the island, and they still do have a grazing pressure, but things have changed. Literally in the last 10 to 15 years, wolves have colonized, wolverine has colonized, and brown bear has colonized. So in the winter, these things are all able to cross from Siberia over the ice onto Wrangel. And there's now a functional pack of wolves on the island, and a number of locations where wolverines are present. And just last year, for the first time, Siberian brown bear was confirmed on the island. Now, the arrival of Siberian brown bear is going to be fascinating. Obviously, it's a huge polar bear denning locate area, and so it looks like we may well end up with hybrids if brown bears push further north and start breeding with polar bears. But the arrival of these three predators has also changed the ecological dynamics going on. So Wrangel contains the largest, holds the largest colony of snow geese in Asia. The population has expanded massively since the arrival of the predators. This is because until wolf arrived, Arctic fox was the largest predator, and they actually heavily controlled the snow goose population. But with the arrival of wolves, wolves have actually started to control Arctic foxes, so reducing their numbers, but not at the same time hunting snow geese. And the last estimate in 2019 was that there were maybe 1 million snow geese breeding or summering on Wrangel. Now, these flocks are really spectacular. They make for some beautiful shots. You've got a line of snow geese here migrating south in August, and they form big white mats on the tundra, and they breed in one huge colony in the center of the island. And they're then wintering in California and Washington, I believe. So it's very interesting to see how rapidly the ecological dynamic has changed on Wrangel with the introduction or the arrival of these natural predators. Wrangel, as I mentioned, does have some coastline which supports seabirds, so great colonies of things like black-legged kittiwakes, Brunnich's guillemots. They present some beautiful photographic opportunities. They almost mimic or mirror Adelie penguins, basically sitting out on these little ice floes. And you also have the Arctic form of black guillemot as well, that replaces pigeon guillemot that you find slightly further south. Now, along the coast, and particularly where there's ice, you get a trio of species. You get Pomeranian skua, top left, an abundance of black-legged kittiwakes here, and also Sabine skulls. And these guys, particularly as we're moving through ice with the ship, they are actually disturbing the ice and causing fish that are basically sheltering under the ice to become exposed. And the poms and the kits and Sabine skulls all follow behind the ship. And it's fantastic watching these Pomeranian skuas basically watching and waiting. When a kittiwake grabs a fish, they will dive in and absolutely hammer the kittiwakes incredibly successfully. And it makes for some beautiful photography as well. The kittiwakes are kind of taken for granted, but they are really magic birds, and watching them over ice, I find them really mesmerizing, actually. So the island is obviously covered in tundra. It is important for breeding waders, and the waders are highly segregated. So, for instance, there are species like Baird's sandpiper, which is this top left one, not my image. In fact, I should say none of these are my images. And Baird's sandpiper, along with knots here, breed right in the interior of the island. And I've only seen a knot once on Wrangel, despite it being the commonest breeding wader. Turnstones and grey plovers are more widespread and occur right down the coast. And things like buff-breasted sandpipers and pecks, they also breed on Wrangel, but very far inland. And this snowy owl, as I mentioned, I'm afraid this is my actual best photo of a snowy owl. They're incredibly difficult to get close to, and numbers on Wrangel do fluctuate with lemmings, but they do tend to keep themselves to themselves and keep a fair distance away from observers. Now, there's very few passerines on the island. Snow bunting is by far the commonest and most widespread, but more recently I have seen things like red-throated pipit and the eastern yellow wagtail, and I suspect that the latter might well actually colonise Wrangel in the not too distant future if it hasn't already done so. So given that Wrangel is so far north, a fully Arctic island, it has a crazy diversity of butterflies. There's 42 species of butterfly breeding on Wrangel. If you compare that, the whole of Greenland has 52 species and Iceland just has 6. We have, what, 50, 57, 58, 59 in the UK. So it's a really remarkable diversity, and that's down to the fact that Wrangel wasn't glaciated during the last big glaciation period. So although it was absolutely freezing, it didn't actually get completely covered in ice, and it allowed a number of species to remain and basically speciate. And there's also one fascinating moth which I have to mention. It's called the Arctic woolly bear, and this species can spend at least 7 years growing as a caterpillar. So basically, it doesn't have enough time each summer to eat all it needs. It has only 45 to 70 days of feeding time each year. And 60% of that time is spent basking, just getting warmth to help digestion. And they basically go into hibernation each winter, and they can withstand temperatures down to -70 or thereabouts. And then as soon as they warm up again, the following year, they get up and they start feeding. And there's some evidence that suggests that these things could take about 15 years in some cases before they actually reach full maturity and they're able to pupate and then hatch the following season. So I mentioned the flora. It is absolutely remarkable. It's mind-blowing, I'd say, on Wrangel. So 449 species, just to give you an example, there's 2,200 species in the Arctic as a whole. 106 are considered endemic to the Arctic, of which 35 endemics are on Wrangel. Svalbard, which is considerably larger, only has 22 endemics. Ellesmere Island, monumentally bigger, only has 28 endemics. So you can see the diversity there. It's just incredible. And in July, August, the floral spectacle rivals places like I guess the Fynbos and the kind of Californian flower meadows in terms of colour, and is a real highlight of any visit to Wrangel. You can't help but get drawn in by these huge colorscapes, even if you don't worry about what individual species are, but just enjoy the floral spectacle for what it is. But there are lots and lots of very cool species. Just a couple as examples. And this is spider saxifrage at the top with these amazing long red tendrils, and purple saxifrage, which some of you may have seen in North Wales, at the bottom right there. So I hope that this lecture presentation has given you a bit of an insight into Chukotka and Wrangel, into the incredible Arctic diversity that this region holds. It is undoubtedly an area that is going to potentially, or probably will, suffer from climatic changes. But at the moment, it seems to be buffering itself better than most other regions in the Arctic. But thank you very much for your attention. And if anybody has any questions, then I will happily take them. So if you just let me stop the screen share, and there we go. Brilliant. Right. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. Completely different world there, and one that I've not sort of heard about before. So a lot of new stuff there, and particularly the plants at the end. That was just phenomenal. I mean, in conservation, we're always trying to battle back the grasses and allow the wildflowers space to move in. But it looks like the ice and the conditions do a lot of that work there and create a wonderful tapestry. Right, so let's look at the questions. Julia asks, is the sea cow the same as the dugong?
Yeah, in fact, it's not the same species, but in the same group, Sirenians, if I remember rightly. So yeah, very, very closely related. But this was a huge sea cow, so a huge dugong, basically. I think it was 3 meters long, something like that. And it obviously lived in really cold water up around the Bering Sea. It used to graze really big seagrass beds all around the Aleutians and along the Kamchatka coast. But the evidence is that it went extinct in Kamchatka and the Kurils a long, long time ago, and that there were just a few isolated populations along the Aleutian chains that were still getting hunted even by by the time Bering got there, the Aleuts were hunting them anyway, and then Bering and his folk came along, news got out, and it didn't take very long for the last ones to vanish.
Mm. Well, that's a shame. Julie also adds, thanks for that, a brilliant presentation. And she has swum with manatees in Florida. So
nice. That made the bucket list stuff. I'd love to do that.
Right. I have a question for you. You showed a fabulous photo of a Laysan albatross, and I've always wondered, but never really looked into it, why albatrosses occur in the Northern Hemisphere in the Pacific Ocean, but not really in the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah, good question. Mainly wind related. So the Pacific is massive. It's absolutely vast. It's a lot bigger than the Atlantic, and it has correspondingly huge weather systems that create pretty continual wind systems around the North Pacific. And the North Atlantic, whilst it does have the Gulf Stream, it doesn't have the same level of weather systems that the Pacific does. And given that albatrosses rely so heavily on wind for flight, they just struggle too much. But that said, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if something like black-browed albatross colonized the North Atlantic, because, you know, we have, what, 2, 3, 4 individuals probably in the Northeast Atlantic at the moment. I suspect it's only a matter of time before we have a breeding attempt at some point. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting that there's, what, 3, 4 species in the North Pacific though. But the equator forms a really big barrier for a lot of them. You know, the only equatorial one is waved albatross in the Galapagos. And if you look at the way that they move, even there, they still use what little there is of the trade winds running from west to east to take them into the Ecuadorian coast, for instance, which really isn't very far in an albatross's world. And they feed on the upwellings there before then going back out to the Galapagos. So they're always using wind wherever possible. And that's the big factor for the North Pacific. It's big enough that it's got a lot of wind continuously. I
suppose the equatorial waved albatrosses, I think they're critically endangered, so not doing that. That's not working out too well for them. That's okay. Oh, that's a really good explanation. Thanks for that. Laurie asks, have you ever run across Ross's gull in this area?
That's a great question. So when I first went up, I was really convinced that we were going to see Ross's gull, and I quizzed everybody who'd been up before about it, and everybody said they had never seen Ross's gull, and I couldn't believe this. And they breed on the Kolyma Delta, which really is not very far away from where we sail on the way up to Wrangel. And there's been one record in, how many years would it be now? Something like 13, 14 seasons of going up to that part of the world. Only one sighting, and that was in a trip that went from Chukotka and sailed all the way along the Siberian coast to I think it was Archangel or something like that. And so it was a September trip, and it was one first winter bird, and that's it. And it completely perplexes me. My theory is that they are wintering in the Sea of Okhotsk, and that they are overland migrants, and that they are doing the whole loop from Okhotsk up to the Siberian coast in one hop, and probably at great height. Because if they were going through the Bering Strait, we would see them. Unless they go through ridiculously early and ridiculously late. But even then, I would expect the ship to be sailing through ice edge where they're feeding. So there's just no real reason to not see them unless they're going in a completely different direction. And given that they get wrecks of Ross's gulls on